Exeter, Rhode Island, January 1892. A churchyard at the edge of town, the ground frozen iron hard beneath a sky the color of cold ash. Picture this: a father standing at the lip of a freshly opened grave, his breath rising in pale clouds above the turned earth, surrounded by neighbors who have come not to mourn but to watch. The hour is mid-morning, but the winter light is thin and flat, offering illumination without warmth, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look already half dead. Lanterns burn anyway, held close against the chill, their flames bending in a wind that moves through the bare oaks at the cemetery's edge with a sound like distant breathing. The town doctor is present, his black bag open on the frozen ground beside him. A stonecutter waits nearby with tools he has brought not to mark a grave, but to open one. No one speaks above a murmur. The cemetery is called Chestnut Hill. It sits on a small rise above the road, surrounded by a low, fieldstone wall that the frost has been slowly displacing for decades. The stones, listing and separating as the ground beneath them, contracts and expands with each passing season. The graves here belong to families whose names appear on the same plots of land in Exeter's town records going back 5 and 6 generations. Names that repeat themselves in the church rolls and the census ledgers and the burial registers, with the particular consistency of communities that do not move, that plant themselves in a place and remain there as the world changes around them. George Brown is one of these men. He was born in Exeter. He farmed land his father farmed before him. He buried his wife in the same cemetery 9 years ago, in the spring of 1883, when Mary Eliza Brown died of the wasting illness that the doctor called consumption, and the neighbors called by older names when the doctor was not present to hear them. He buried his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, in this same ground. The following year, 1884, when the same illness took her by the same slow degrees it had taken her mother. 2 graves, same family, same disease, 12 months apart. His daughter Mercy died on January 17th of this year. She was 19 years old. She is buried here, in the coldest part of the winter ground, 2 months in the frozen earth. His son Edwin is at home in the farmhouse at the bottom of the hill, too weak to walk, coughing blood into rags that his father burns in the fireplace, because no one has told him this is useless, and because doing something, anything, feels better than doing nothing. Edwin has been sick for years. He traveled to Colorado Springs 2 years ago because someone told George that the dry western air cured consumption, that men came back from Colorado restored, breathing clean, returned to themselves. Edwin came back worse. He is 24 years old. He is dying of exactly what his mother died of, what his sister died of, what his other sister died of 2 months ago in this same bed, in this same house, at the bottom of this same hill. 4 members of one family, the same illness, moving through them in sequence, taking them one by one with a patience that feels, to George Brown and to every neighbor who has watched this happen, less like misfortune and more like intention. This is why they are here. This is why the stonecutter has his tools and the doctor has his bag and the neighbors have their lanterns, gathered on a frozen hillside in January to open the grave of a 19-year-old girl who has been in the ground for 2 months. They are going to examine her. They are going to look for signs. George Brown is not an uneducated man. He is not a man who arrived at this morning lightly or without resistance. He resisted for weeks while his neighbors talked and his son deteriorated and the winter deepened around the farmhouse until the roads became impassable and the nearest physician was a day's journey away. He resisted because he is a practical man, a farmer, a man who has lived his life in accordance with what can be observed and verified and acted upon. He did not want to believe that the explanation for what was happening to his family was the explanation his neighbors were offering him. But Edwin is dying, and desperation has its own logic, its own way of dissolving the boundaries between what a man believes and what a man does when everything else has failed. So he gave his permission. He came to the churchyard. He stands here now at the edge of his daughter's opened grave, while the stonecutter and 2 neighbors go down into the cold earth with their tools, and he waits for what they will find. What happens in the next hour will be witnessed by a dozen townspeople, reported 3 weeks later in the Providence Journal, under the headline, Vampirism, and read as far away as Boston and New York, passed around in parlors and newspaper offices and medical societies as evidence of something that respectable modern America preferred to believe had been left behind in an older, darker, less enlightened world. It had not been left behind. It had been here all along, in the farming communities of southern New England, quiet and persistent and passed down through exactly the kind of generations represented by every name carved into every stone in Chestnut Hill Cemetery. And Mercy Brown was not the first. Exeter, Rhode Island, in the final decades of the 19th century, was the kind of place that existed in the spaces between things, between cities and wilderness, between the old world of folk belief inherited from European grandparents and the new world of laboratories and microscopes and men in universities who believed they were finally close to understanding what disease actually was. The farms sat close together along dirt roads that turned to mud in spring and froze hard in winter, and the families who worked them knew each other's business, attended each other's churches, buried each other's dead. And in those years, they were burying a great many dead. The disease had many names. Physicians called it phthisis, from the Greek word for wasting, a word that carried in its very syllables the sense of something being diminished, reduced, erased. Common people called it the White Plague, for the pallor it pressed onto its victims like a slow bleaching of everything vital. But the name that stuck, the name that encoded in plain English exactly what the communities experiencing it believed was happening, was consumption, because that is what it appeared to do. It consumed people, it consumed them from the inside, steadily and without mercy, over weeks and months and sometimes years, until there was nothing left to consume. To understand why communities in New England began digging up their dead, you must first understand what consumption looked like to a family watching it move through their home. It began quietly, a cough that would not resolve, a fatigue that sleep did not repair. These were easy to dismiss, easy to attribute to the hardship of rural life in a cold climate, where overwork and inadequate nutrition were ordinary rather than exceptional conditions. But the cough deepened. It became persistent, then constant, then violent, the kind of coughing that bent a person double and left them gasping, the kind that woke the whole household in the dark hours, before dawn. And then, unmistakably, blood appeared in what they coughed up, bright red and undeniable, the body announcing through the most direct means available to it that something had gone catastrophically wrong in the lungs. The pallor intensified, the cheeks grew hollow, the eyes took on a brightness that the Victorians sometimes described as beautiful, a feverish luminosity that we now understand as the physiological effect of chronic infection, elevated temperature, and the particular exhaustion of a body fighting a battle it was slowly losing. The victim lost weight with a consistency that could almost be measured week by week, the flesh falling away until the person appeared diminished, attenuated, a thinner version of themselves, as if something was slowly drawing the substance out of them. Night sweat soaked through bedclothes. Appetite disappeared. The ability to perform ordinary labor vanished weeks or months before death itself arrived. And then, when death came, it often came not alone. This is the detail that transformed a terrible disease into something that felt supernatural to the families experiencing it. Tuberculosis, though no one in these farming communities understood the mechanism, spreads through the air. It moves between people who share confined spaces, who breathe the same air, who sleep in the same rooms through long winters when windows stay sealed against the cold. It moves through families with a patience that appears, to human observers without microscopes or germ theory, to be deliberate, purposeful, directed. A mother sickened and died. Within months, a daughter began to cough. The daughter weakened and died. The son grew pale and feverish. The pattern repeated itself with a consistency that felt, to the people living through it, less like coincidence and more like something working its way methodically through the household, selecting them one by one, draining each in turn before moving to the next. They had a framework for this. They had always had a framework for this. The settlers who built New England's farming communities in the 17th and 18th centuries carried with them from England, from Scotland, from Germany and Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe, a rich inheritance of folk belief about the dead and what the dead could do to the living. The revenant, the corpse that did not stay peacefully in the ground, that returned in some form to trouble the survivors, that fed in some manner on the vitality of those it had loved in life, was not an invention of Gothic novels. It was a belief woven through the folk traditions of almost every culture that had ever faced epidemic death, without the tools to explain it scientifically. In Eastern Europe, this figure had specific names and specific attributes. In England and its colonial offshoots, the belief was less formalized, more diffuse, expressed in folklore and superstition, rather than in named creatures with catalogued behaviors. But the core, terror was the same across all of these traditions. The dead, under certain conditions, did not release their hold on the living. Something of them persisted, and that persistence came at a cost to those left behind. When consumption arrived in a household and began its sequential harvest, this inherited framework was waiting to receive it. The disease had every characteristic that folk tradition associated with the revenant's work. The victims grew pale and thin, as if drained. They weakened and faded, as if something were drawing the life from them each night. And most critically, they died in sequence, one following another into the ground as if connected by something invisible, as if the first death had opened a door that would not close until the family itself was exhausted. The question was not whether something was feeding on these families. To the people watching it happen, the evidence of feeding was visible in every hollowed face, every blood-stained cloth, every body lowered into the cold Rhode Island ground. The question was only what precisely was doing the feeding, and whether anything could be done to stop it. And so, with the logic of people who had exhausted every other explanation and were watching their children die, they went to the graveyard with shovels, and they began to look for answers among the dead. Mercy Brown was the last. She wasn't the beginning. To understand what happened in that Exeter churchyard in the winter of 1892, you need to understand that the exhumation of Mercy Brown was not an act of isolated madness, not a community temporarily unhinged by grief and superstition, not an aberration in an otherwise rational society that had briefly lost its footing. It was the final documented expression of a practice that had been quietly occurring across the rural communities of southern New England for more than a century. A practice with its own internal logic, its own accumulated tradition, its own geography of fear, passed down through generations of families who had faced the same sequential losses and arrived at the same desperate conclusion. The region was specific: Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, Massachusetts. Not the cities, not Boston or Providence or Hartford, where newspapers circulated daily and physicians maintained regular practices, and the mechanisms of modern institutional life provided alternative frameworks for understanding why people died in clusters and what, if anything, could be done about it. But the towns between the cities, the farming communities connected by dirt roads that became mud in spring and ice in winter, where a doctor might be a full day's ride away, and where the knowledge that mattered most for survival was the knowledge passed between neighbors, between parents and children, between the living and the memory of those who had gone before them. The timeline stretches back to at least the 1780s, possibly earlier, into decades for which the documentary record is too sparse to confirm specific cases with certainty. What the record does confirm, pieced together from town ledgers, personal diaries, letters, and the occasional newspaper notice, is a pattern of exhumations occurring quietly, regularly, and with enough community acceptance that they were rarely treated as remarkable events, requiring official investigation or public explanation. They were as much a part of rural New England life as barn raisings and church suppers. They were simply never discussed outside the communities where they happened. These were not secret acts, performed in darkness by frightened individuals acting alone. They were community rituals. Neighbors participated. The local physician was sometimes present, not to prevent the exhumation, but to observe it, to apply whatever medical judgment he could bring to the examination of a body that had been in the ground for weeks or months, to serve as a witness whose presence lent the proceedings a degree of institutional gravity that the community found reassuring. In some documented cases, a clergyman attended. The events were noted in town records with the same matter-of-fact brevity used to record births and harvests, and the prices paid for cordwood at the end of winter. The earliest well-documented case comes from Connecticut in the 1740s. A farmer named Stukely, known in the historical record by the nickname Snuffy, lost his wife and several of his children to consumption in rapid succession over a period of a few years. Following what neighbors described as local custom, a phrase that implies the practice was already established before this particular family's crisis, the family exhumed the first to die and burned the organs, mixing the resulting ashes into a medicinal preparation that was administered to the surviving sick. The account survives because a neighbor recorded it in a letter, noting the event not with horror or even particular surprise, but with a detached interest of someone describing a familiar procedure being applied to a difficult situation. The Ray family of Jewett City, Connecticut, presents one of the more thoroughly documented cases in the historical record. Between 1845 and 1854, the family lost 5 members to consumption in the familiar, sequential pattern. When the losses became undeniable in their progression, the family exhumed 2 of the dead and burned the bodies completely. The event was reported in the Norwich Courier in 1854, the newspaper's tone mixing mild scientific skepticism with genuine uncertainty about how to characterize a community practice that clearly predated the current generation of townspeople and carried the weight of established tradition rather than recent invention. In Vermont, the Spaulding family of Dummerston lost multiple members to consumption in the early years of the 1800s and conducted an exhumation that was documented in unusual detail by a local physician who attended with professional reluctance. The physician left behind notes describing the condition of the exhumed body in clinical terms, including his careful, reasoned explanation of why the corpse appeared to show the signs that the assembled community had identified as evidence of continued activity after death. He noted the temperature of the ground, the season of burial, the expected rate of decomposition under those specific conditions. He explained, patiently and thoroughly, why the appearance of the body was consistent with normal processes and inconsistent with anything requiring a supernatural explanation. His explanation was noted. His explanation was ignored. The ritual proceeded exactly as the community had intended it to proceed before the physician arrived. This detail, repeated across case after case in the documented record, is the one that matters most for understanding what these rituals actually were. The presence of medical authority did not stop the exhumations. Scientific explanation did not dissolve the belief. The physicians who attended these events were not ignorant men. They understood decomposition. They understood temperature and soil composition and the variable rates at which bodies broke down under different conditions of burial. They could explain, in terms drawn from their training, every physical characteristic the communities pointed to as evidence of undeath, and none of it made any difference to the family standing at the graveside, because the belief was not, at its root, a belief about vampires in the literary sense, about creatures with fangs and deliberate malevolence and supernatural powers drawn from Eastern European folklore. It was a belief about connection, about the persistence of the bond between the dead and the living, about the possibility that death, under certain conditions, did not fully sever what had existed between people who had shared blood and breath and the same small rooms through the same long winters for decades. It was a belief about love that had nowhere left to go, and about the terrible things that love without direction could do to those it had been left behind to find. The ritual worked as follows. When a family began losing multiple members to consumption in sequence, the Yasa community identified the first to die, or sometimes the most recently dead, as the most likely source of the continuing drain on the living. The body was exhumed. It was examined for the specific signs that the folk tradition had established across generations as diagnostically meaningful. Flesh that had not decomposed at the expected rate given the time elapsed since burial. A heart or liver that appeared to contain liquid blood. Limbs that retained an unusual degree of flexibility. Any of these signs, singly or in combination, confirmed the diagnosis. The dead had not released their hold. If the signs were found, the heart was removed. Sometimes the liver as well. The organs were burned, most often on a flat stone near the cemetery, the smoke rising into whatever sky the season provided, while the assembled neighbors stood in silence or in prayer, watching the fire do what they had come to ask it to do. The ashes were collected carefully, dissolved in water, or sometimes in medicine. The sick person was already taking and administered to the living survivors, whose continued decline had prompted the exhumation in the first place. The logic was complete and circular, and required no external validation. What the dead had taken from the living would be restored through this reversal, this burning away of whatever invisible thread still connected the corpse beneath the ground to the household above it. Most of these cases were never reported in newspapers. They exist in the documentary record only because someone kept a diary, or a town clerk made a brief marginal notation that survived the clearing of old files, or a letter passed between families and was preserved in a trunk that outlasted the people who wrote it. The communities conducting these rituals did not consider them newsworthy. They considered them private, practical, and profoundly sad, necessary interventions rather than dramatic events. The same quiet category as any other desperate measure taken by families who were watching themselves disappear one by one and had exhausted every other explanation for why. Between the Stuckley case of the 1740s and the Brown case of 1892, researchers have documented more than a dozen confirmed exhumations in southern New England, and suspect considerably more that left no recoverable trace. The practice was not concentrated in any single town or county. It moved with the disease, appearing wherever consumption appeared in its most devastating sequential form. Wherever a family lost enough members in close enough succession that the pattern became impossible to attribute to coincidence alone. Each case followed the same template. Each case ended the same way, with the sick survivor dying anyway, weeks or months after the ritual, the disease completing what it had started regardless of what had been burned and dissolved, and administered in the desperate interval between exhumation and death. The remedy never worked. The tradition persisted anyway, for more than a century, because the tradition was never really about curing the sick. It was about doing something. It was about refusing to accept that the dead were simply gone, and the living were simply next. It was about the human need to find an agent behind suffering, a mechanism behind loss, a door that could be closed against the thing that was coming through it. Desperation, in Exeter, Rhode Island, in the winter of 1892, had a name, and that name was George Brown, standing at the edge of a frozen grave, waiting to see what his neighbors would find. George Brown was a farmer. That is the first thing to understand about him, and it matters more than it might initially seem. Not a superstitious man in the romantic sense. Not a figure from an older and darker century, misplaced into the modern world by accident of geography or education, but an ordinary working farmer in a small Rhode Island town, a man whose entire life had been organized around observable cause and effect, around the reliable relationship between seasons and soil and labor and outcome. He fixed what broke. He planted what the ground would hold. He made decisions based on what he could see and measure and verify. What he could see and measure and verify by the winter of 1892 was the near-total destruction of his family. His wife, Mary Eliza Brown, died in the spring of 1883. She had been sick for 2 years before the end came, the familiar progression of consumption moving through her with the patience the disease always showed, the cough deepening through one winter and persisting into the next, the weight falling away in increments that became visible month by month, the nightly fever rising and falling in its relentless rhythm, until the rising finally stopped, because there was nothing left to burn. She was buried in Chestnut Hill Cemetery in April of 1883. George was left with 4 children, a farm, and the particular silence of a house, from which its organizing presence has been permanently removed. His daughter Mary Olive began coughing the following winter. By 1884, she was gone, barely 12 months after her mother, buried in the same cemetery, a few rows from the same fieldstone wall. She was 20 years old. 2 graves, same family, same disease, 12 months apart. For several years after Mary Olive's death, the disease appeared to relent. Edwin and Mercy grew into young adulthood. The farm continued its rhythms. The grief settled into the background, the way grief does, when life insists on continuing, becoming part of the texture of ordinary days, rather than their consuming feature. George Brown was not a man given to extended mourning. He had land to work and children to feed and winters to prepare for. He continued. Then Edwin began to lose weight. He was in his early 20s when the first signs appeared, the same signs that had announced the same sentence in his mother and his sister before him, the persistent cough that would not resolve through spring, the fatigue that accumulated faster than rest could address it, the hollowing of the face that his neighbors noticed before Edwin himself was willing to acknowledge it, or perhaps before he was willing to say aloud what he already knew it meant. George sent his son west to Colorado Springs, where the altitude and the dry mountain air had developed a reputation among physicians for slowing the disease in its early stages, for giving the lungs a better environment in which to stabilize or recover. Men went to Colorado and came back restored, or so the accounts said. Edwin went in good faith, stayed the prescribed period, breathed the clean air above the plains, and returned to Exeter in 1891 with the same diagnosis he had carried west and nothing to show for the journey, except the knowledge that distance had not helped, and that he was going to die in the same house where his mother and sister had died, probably within the year. Mercy Lena Brown, the youngest of George's surviving children, fell sick in the summer of 1891. She declined more rapidly than the others had. Where the disease had taken Mary Eliza over 2 years, and Mary Olive over several months, it moved through Mercy with a briskness that left little time for the false hope that sometimes accompanied the disease's slower progressions. She died on January 17th, 1892. She was 19 years old. She was buried in Chestnut Hill Cemetery, within days of her death. The burial necessarily shallow, because the January frost had hardened the earth to a depth that made digging difficult, the ground yielding only reluctantly to the gravedigger's tools in the grey winter cold. Edwin was confined to his bed by February. He was 24 years old, and he was dying of the same illness that had killed his mother, his sister Mary Olive, and now his sister Mercy, in the same house, on the same farm, while his father sat with him in the evenings and listened to the cough that marked each night's passing, and the neighbours talked quietly among themselves about what the pattern of losses in the Brown family meant. The neighbours came to George with the suggestion that communities across Rhode Island and Connecticut had been acting on for more than a century. The sequential nature of the Brown family's losses, they said, was not coincidence, and not simply the way of a disease moving through a confined household. Something was sustaining itself. Something, in the connection between the newly dead and the still living, was feeding the continuation of the illness. Mercy was 2 months in the ground. It was not yet too late to look. George consulted Dr. Harold Metcalf, the family physician, who was a practical man with a medical education and no professional tolerance for folk remedies dressed in the language of necessity. Metcalf told George plainly that consumption was a disease of the body caused by processes that science was beginning to understand, that the deaths in his family, however terrible in their sequence, had a natural explanation, and that opening the graves of his dead children would accomplish nothing except causing him additional suffering he did not need. George Brown knew Metcalf was right. He was a practical man. He understood, at the level of ordinary reasoning, that his neighbour's explanation was not a medical explanation, and that burning a dead girl's heart would not save his dying son. But Edwin was still dying. The medicine had nothing left to offer. The western air had failed. The prayers had not been answered in any way George could detect, and the neighbours kept coming, patient and certain in the way that inherited tradition makes people certain, offering the only remaining explanation for why this had happened, and the only remaining action that might, in their collective experience, do something to stop it. George Brown was a practical man, and the most practical fact in front of him was that his last surviving child was coughing blood in the next room, and every rational option had already been exhausted. He gave his permission. On the 18th of March, 1892, George Brown, Dr. Metcalf, and a group of neighbours gathered at Chestnut Hill Cemetery in the thin light of a late winter morning. Metcalf attended, not because he believed in the procedure, but because he believed his presence might limit its scope, might introduce some degree of medical observation into an event he could not prevent. He brought his bag. He brought his notebook. He intended to document what he found and to provide, at each stage, the scientific explanation for whatever condition the bodies presented. The graves of Mary Eliza and Mary Olive were opened first. Both bodies had decomposed as expected for the time elapsed since burial. The neighbours examined them, acknowledged what they found, and moved to the grave that mattered most. Mercy had been buried in frozen ground in the coldest part of the year, 2 months prior. Her body had not decomposed at the rate a summer burial would have produced. The cold had slowed the process significantly. When Dr. Metcalf examined her, Her tissues retained a preservation that departed visibly from what the other graves had shown. Her heart, when examined, still contained what appeared to be liquid blood. Metcalfe wrote his explanation in his notes, with the patience of a man who understood he was performing a duty no one present intended to heed. The preservation was a consequence of burial temperature. Frozen ground retarded decomposition. Liquid blood in the heart was a documented post-mortem finding under such conditions, the result of the body's own processes, rather than any evidence of continued life or activity. There was nothing present that required any explanation beyond standard pathology. The neighbours did not accept the explanation. They had not come to Chestnut Hill Cemetery for an explanation. They had come for a remedy, and the condition of Mercy's body confirmed, in the framework they had inherited and trusted, that they had found what they were looking for. Mercy's heart and liver were removed and burned on a flat rock near the cemetery wall. The ashes were dissolved in water. The preparation was carried down the hill to the farmhouse and administered to Edwin. Edwin Brown died in May of 1892, 2 months after the exhumation of his sister. He was 24 years old. He was the last of his family. The remedy had not worked, but in the logic of the tradition that had brought those neighbours to that frozen cemetery on that March morning, this outcome proved nothing and disproved nothing. The disease had simply progressed too far before the intervention was made. It had always been, perhaps, already too late for Edwin. Mercy remained in the ground at Chestnut Hill. She remains there still. The science arrived too late, and too quietly, to save Mercy Brown. In March of 1882, a German physician and microbiologist named Robert Koch stood before the Berlin Physiological Society and announced that he had identified the organism responsible for tuberculosis. He called it Mycobacterium tuberculosis. He had cultured it, photographed it, and demonstrated conclusively that it was the direct and singular cause of a disease that had been killing human beings in enormous numbers for thousands of years. It was one of the most significant announcements in the history of medicine. It established, for the first time with scientific rigor, that tuberculosis was not hereditary, not a consequence of moral weakness or constitutional inadequacy, not the product of bad air or divine judgment, but an infectious bacterial disease transmitted from person to person through the air they shared. Koch's announcement was made 10 years before the exhumation of Mercy Brown. The communities of rural Rhode Island were not ignorant of the new science. Newspapers had carried accounts of germ theory. Local physicians had read, or read summaries of, the emerging literature on bacterial disease. Dr. Metcalfe, who stood at Chestnut Hill Cemetery in March of 1892 and examined Mercy Brown's preserved body and wrote his clinical explanation in his notebook, understood Koch's findings. He understood that what he was looking at had a bacterial explanation and not a supernatural one, but understanding a scientific framework and trusting it over the accumulated evidence of lived experience are two different things, and the accumulated evidence of lived experience for the farming families of southern New England was a century of watching consumption move through households in exactly the sequential pattern that the folk tradition had always described and the folk remedy had always attempted to address. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the relationship between medical science and the vampire belief in 19th century New England. They were not simply opposites. They were two different languages describing the same observable phenomenon. Koch's germ theory said that tuberculosis spread through the air between people in close proximity, that a sick person infected those around them through the invisible transmission of bacteria, that the sequential nature of family deaths reflected the mechanics of contagion moving through a shared living space. The folk tradition said that the dead maintained a connection to the living that drained vitality from those they had left behind, that the sequential nature of family deaths reflected the dead drawing on the living through a bond that burial had not severed. Both explanations recognized that the deaths were connected. Both recognized that something was moving through the family. Both recognized that the first to die had a relationship to the deaths that followed. The mechanism each proposed was entirely different, but the pattern each was attempting to explain was identical, because there was only one pattern, and it was the pattern that tuberculosis actually produced when it moved through a confined household over months and years. The folk tradition had, in other words, correctly identified the epidemiology of the disease long before science gave that epidemiology a name. It had the wrong mechanism and the right observation, which is precisely why a century of physician attendance at exhumations, a century of careful clinical explanation offered at gravesides to families who had watched the sequential logic of the disease with their own eyes, had failed to displace the ritual. The physicians were explaining the mechanism, the families already knew the pattern, and the pattern was what the ritual was responding to. There is a further layer to this collision between science and folk belief, one that is rarely discussed in accounts of the New England vampire tradition, and it concerns what happened to bodies in the ground, the signs that communities identified as evidence of undeath, the preservation of flesh beyond the expected rate of decomposition, the appearance of liquid blood in the heart, the flexibility of limbs, were not fabrications. They were real observations of real physical conditions that the families conducting exhumations genuinely encountered. What the communities lacked was not observational accuracy, but explanatory framework. Cold ground slows decomposition significantly. A body buried in January in frozen Rhode Island soil will not decompose at the same rate as a body buried in July. 2 months in frozen ground could leave a body in a state of preservation that appeared, to observers without formal training in post-mortem pathology, genuinely anomalous. Mercy Brown, buried in the coldest part of winter, showed exactly this kind of preservation when her grave was opened in March. The presence of liquid blood in the heart after death is a documented and well understood phenomenon in forensic pathology. Blood pools and settles in the body after death, according to gravity and the breakdown of cellular structures. Under certain conditions of temperature and elapsed time, what appears to be fresh liquid blood can be found in cardiac chambers. This is not evidence of continued life. It is evidence of the body's own post-mortem chemistry proceeding under specific environmental conditions. The flexibility of limbs in recently buried bodies, another sign that communities interpreted as meaningful, reflects the normal progression of rigor mortis, which sets in and then resolves within a predictable window after death, leaving the body once again pliable before decomposition advances to the point of rigidity, returning through different mechanisms. None of these phenomena required supernatural explanation. All of them, to an observer standing in an open cemetery without a medical education, in a community with an established interpretive framework that assigned specific meaning to exactly these observations, would have appeared to confirm what the tradition had always said they confirmed. The science and the belief were, in a precise and painful sense, talking past each other. The physicians pointed to temperature and post-mortem chemistry. The families pointed to the body of their daughter, 2 months in the ground, showing signs that the tradition had identified for 100 years as meaningful. Both parties were observing the same physical reality. Only one of them had the framework to explain it correctly, and that framework had arrived too recently, too abstractly, and through too few channels to displace a tradition rooted in the direct visceral experience of sequential family death. Bram Stoker was aware of this collision. He was a careful researcher, and when he encountered newspaper accounts of the Mercy Brown case in the mid-1890s Working on his novel, he recognized in the New England vampire tradition something that the European literary tradition he was drawing on had never quite captured: the specific domestic, grief-soaked reality of vampire belief as it actually existed in communities facing epidemic death. Not Gothic castles and aristocratic predators, but farmhouses and frozen cemeteries and fathers who had already lost everyone and were willing to do anything that offered one remaining chance. Lucy Westenra, the consumptive young woman in Dracula, who must be exhumed and destroyed before she can continue drawing vitality from those around her, bears the unmistakable marks of this American influence. Pale, wasting, beautiful in her deterioration, dying in the sequential shadow of her own illness, while those who love her are unable to stop what is happening. She is recognizably a literary descendant of Mercy Brown and the other young women whose bodies were examined in New England churchyards, while the community assembled to watch, and the doctor stood nearby and wrote his explanations in a notebook that no one would read. The novel was published in 1897. The Mercy Brown story had appeared in the Providence Journal in 1892. The 5 years between them are, in the history of vampire mythology, among the most consequential, the period in which an American folk practice rooted in the genuine epidemiology of a bacterial disease crossed the Atlantic in newspaper form and entered the imagination of a writer who transformed it into the shape that the modern world would recognize as the definitive vampire story. The disease created the belief created the ritual, documented and reported and eventually read across an ocean, created the myth. The chain of transmission was, in its own way, as direct as the airborne passage of bacteria between people sharing the same dark room through the same long winter. Something moved from the sick to the healthy. Something was lost in the passage. Something persisted after the dying was done. The vampire was not invented in New England. It arrived there. To understand the full depth of what happened in the farming communities of Rhode Island and Connecticut, you need to trace the belief back to its origins, back through the generations of settlers who carried it across the Atlantic, embedded in the cultural memory of communities that had been living with epidemic death for far longer than America had existed. The folk tradition that George Brown's neighbors brought to Chestnut Hill Cemetery in 1892 was not a local invention. It was the final expression of a belief system that had been forming and reforming across centuries of European plague, famine, and the particular terror of diseases that moved through populations in ways that no available framework could adequately explain. The word vampire itself enters the written record in Western Europe in the early 18th century, carried westward from the Balkans and Eastern Europe by Austrian military officials who encountered the belief during their administration of newly acquired Serbian territories. But the belief, the word named, was far older than the word. In the Slavic tradition, it was the upia, in Romanian, the strigoi, in Greek, the vrikolakas, names that varied by geography and language but described the same fundamental figure, the dead who did not stay dead, who returned in some form to trouble the living, who fed on the vitality of those they had left behind, who spread contagion from the grave outward through the family and community that surrounded it. These were not creatures of aristocratic Gothic imagination. They were creatures of the village and the epidemic. They emerged from the specific experience of communities that had watched disease move through their populations in the sequential clustering pattern that bacterial and viral illness actually produces when it encounters populations with no immunity and no treatment, and had developed, over generations of that experience, a framework for understanding what they were seeing that placed the source of contagion in the dead, rather than in any invisible organism. They lack the tools to detect The cases that brought the vampire belief to the formal attention of Western European officials and intellectuals occurred in Serbia in 1725. A Serbian peasant named Arnold Paule died after falling from a hay wagon. Within weeks of his death, several people in his village fell ill and died. The survivors reported that Paule had been troubling them, appearing at night, causing the sickness that was claiming them. The village authorities, operating within the folk tradition, exhumed Paule's body 40 days after his death and found it in a state of preservation that they documented carefully. Fresh blood around the mouth, flexible limbs, skin that appeared vital rather than decomposed. They drove a stake through the body. They burned it. They performed the same procedure on the 4 people who had died after him. The case was investigated by Austrian military officials who produced a formal report, a document remarkable in the history of vampire belief, because it represents the first time secular administrative authority applied itself to the phenomenon with the intention of documenting rather than dismissing it. The report was published in German newspapers and subsequently translated and distributed across Western Europe, where it was read with a mixture of fascination, skepticism, and the particular unease that comes from official documentation, lending credibility to something that educated opinion preferred to regard as primitive superstition. A second Serbian case, that of Peter Blagojevich in 1725, produced similar official documentation and similar European circulation. Within a year, the vampire had moved from Balkan folk belief to European intellectual conversation, the subject of academic treatises, newspaper articles, and eventually the kind of literary attention that would, over the following century and a half, transform the figure entirely. But the literary transformation should not obscure what the original belief was actually about. In both the Paule and Blagojevich cases, and in the dozens of similar cases documented across Eastern Europe throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the pattern is identical to the one that would appear in New England a century later. A person died. Others in the same community began dying. The deaths followed a sequential, clustering pattern that the community recognized as connected. The first to die was identified as the source. The body was exhumed, examined for signs, and destroyed by a method the tradition prescribed. The disease in many of these Eastern European cases was almost certainly plague or typhus, or one of the other epidemic illnesses that moved through Balkan villages in the 17th and 18th centuries with the same sequential family clustering, pattern that tuberculosis would later produce in New England farmhouses. The mechanism was different. The observable pattern was the same, and the belief that assembled around that pattern was the same belief, expressed through different specific traditions in different geographies, because it was a belief that human communities arrived independently when faced with the same terrible experience of watching death move through their families in a sequence that felt purposeful. The settlers who built New England's farming communities in the 17th and 18th centuries brought this inheritance with them, not as a formal doctrine or an explicit system of belief, but as the kind of embedded cultural knowledge that communities carry without examining, the kind that surfaces only when the circumstances that activate it are present. For generations, the circumstances were not sufficiently extreme. The disease moved through individual families, but not with the sustained, sequential intensity that would demand a communal response. The knowledge waited. When tuberculosis arrived in its full devastating form in the rural communities of southern New England in the late 18th century, the knowledge activated. The belief that had developed in Serbian plague villages and Scottish fever parishes and German epidemic years, recognized in the sequential family deaths of Rhode Island farming communities the same pattern it had always been built to explain, and it offered the same response it had always offered. The The specific ritual details varied somewhat by geography and family tradition. The core logic did not vary at all. The dead were connected to the living. The connection could be severed. The severing required physical intervention with the body. The intervention, if successful, would stop the sequential drain on the survivors. This is the line that runs unbroken from a Serbian village in 1725 to a Rhode Island cemetery in 1892. Not a line of direct transmission, not a conscious inheritance passed deliberately from one generation to the next, but a line of parallel response to parallel experience. The same human conclusion, reached by different communities, facing the same unbearable pattern of loss. And then the line extended one step further. Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, 5 years after the Providence Journal reported the exhumation of Mercy Brown. The novel drew on multiple sources, on Eastern European vampire folklore, on the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, on the Gothic literary tradition that had been building since the late 18th century. But the specific character of Lucy Westenra, the pale, consumptive young woman who must be exhumed and destroyed before she drains the vitality of those around her, bears the unmistakable influence of the American cases that Stoker encountered in newspaper form during his research. The connection between the New England vampire tradition and Dracula is documented. Stoker kept research notes, and those notes reference newspaper accounts of American vampire cases. The Providence Journal coverage of the Brown exhumation was precisely the kind of source a careful researcher working on a novel about the undead would have sought out and read carefully. Whether Mercy Brown specifically shaped Lucy Westenra's character is a matter of scholarly argument. That the New England tradition influenced the novel is not seriously disputed. What Stoker did, in transforming the folk tradition into literary form, was fix the vampire's shape in the cultural imagination in a way that the folk tradition itself had never done. The village vampire of Eastern Europe and rural New England was a specific, local, domestic creature, bound to a particular family and a particular community and a particular sequence of deaths. It had no universal characteristics beyond the pattern it expressed. Stoker's vampire was universal, portable, detached from the epidemiological reality that had generated the belief and reattached to a framework of Gothic atmosphere and supernatural power that could travel anywhere and mean anything. In doing so, he preserved the vampire while erasing the plague. The figure that emerged from Dracula and the century of literary and cinematic elaboration that followed it bears almost no resemblance to the belief that brought George Brown's neighbors to Chestnut Hill Cemetery. The fanged aristocrat of modern imagination is as far from Mercy Brown as a cathedral is from a farmhouse. But the distance between them is not a distance of invention. It is a distance of transformation. The same core fear about death moving through families in sequence, about the dead maintaining a connection to the living that should have been severed, dressed in successive layers of literary elaboration, until the epidemiological reality that generated it became invisible. The plague created the belief. The belief crossed an ocean in the memories of settlers. The settlers brought it to the farming communities of New England, where it waited for the disease that would activate it. The disease arrived. The rituals followed. A journalist reported them. A novelist read the reports. The novelist transformed the reports into fiction. The fiction became the dominant cultural form of the vampire myth. And somewhere beneath all of that, in a small cemetery on a rise above a Rhode Island road, a 19-year-old girl named Mercy Brown remained in the ground, the most famous endpoint of a tradition that began not with fangs and castles, but with villages full of the dying, and communities full of the desperate, and the very human need to believe that death had a face that could be found and confronted and made, finally, to stop.